So let's talk about one of the most shocking legal dramas of our time, the trial of Oscar Pistorius. This is a story that has everything. A global hero who becomes a convicted murderer. It's a case that really makes you stop and question everything you think you know about fame, about disability, and ultimately about justice.
And this is the central conflict, right? The two faces of Oscar Pistorius. On one hand, you've got the Blade Runner, an absolute superstar, a hero who smashed barriers and inspired millions of people around the world. But then, there's the other side, the man accused of murdering his girlfriend. This shocking contrast is exactly why the world couldn't look away, turning a deeply personal tragedy into a massive media event. All right, first up, a fallen hero. To really get why this was such a huge deal, you have to remember just how big of a star Oscar Pistorius was. I mean, he wasn't just an athlete. He was a global icon, a symbol of what's possible. Let's dig into how that incredible image came crashing down, literally overnight. So here are the cold, hard facts that no one disputes. February 14th, 2013, Valentine's Day. Reeva Steenkamp is inside a locked toilet cubicle in Pistorius' house. Pistorius is on the other side of that door with his 9mm pistol. He fires 4 shots. 3 of them hit and kill her. And everything, the entire decade-long legal mess that followed, it all boiled down to one single haunting question. Why?
And that one question, why, led to 2 completely different stories that went head-to-head in court. Was it a terrible accident, or was it murder?
So the entire trial really boiled down to these 2 competing narratives. The defense's story, it was a tragic, horrible mistake. You have a vulnerable man without his prosthetic legs on, in the dark, absolutely terrified that there's an intruder in his house. The prosecution, nope. They painted a way darker picture. They said that story was a complete lie, a cover-up for what really happened, a jealous argument that ended in deliberate murder.
Okay, so how do you figure out the truth? The court had to sift through a ton of evidence, a lot of it contested. Let's dive into the key questions at the center of the whole thing.
First up, what were they saying to each other? The court dove right into their private text messages, hoping to find some clue about what their relationship was really like.
And what they found was, well, it was complicated. It was like looking at 2 different relationships. The defense pointed out that, look, 90% of these messages are totally loving and normal. But then the prosecution came back with some really damning texts, messages where Reeva actually wrote, "I'm scared of you sometimes," talking about his temper. That painted a very different picture, one of a volatile, maybe even controlling relationship.
Okay, now for one of the most crucial and most debated pieces of evidence, the screams. What did the neighbors actually hear that night?
So this was a huge deal. The prosecution's whole case kind of rested on this. Neighbors testifying they heard a woman screaming before the shots were fired. That suggests a huge argument, right? But the defense came back with a chilling counterargument. They said those high-pitched screams, that wasn't Reeva. That was a hysterical Oscar Pistorius screaming after he realized what he'd done. And they even brought in an acoustics expert who said, hey, it's pretty unlikely you could clearly hear a scream from inside that toilet from so far away. So who do you believe? All of this then led the trial down a fascinating and complicated path into Oscar Pistorius' mind. What was his mental state? The defense argued you couldn't possibly understand his actions without understanding his psychology.
So a psychiatric evaluation found that Pistorius had a serious anxiety disorder. It made him hypervigilant, constantly on edge. The defense team really leaned into this. They argued that, on his stumps, he felt trapped, unable to run away, so his only response to fear was to fight back. This deep vulnerability, they said, explains why he reacted the way he did. But the prosecution, they weren't buying it. They accused him of just putting on a show in court, using his emotions to try and escape responsibility. So with all this conflicting evidence, the legal battle was messy. The journey from the first verdict to the final one was an absolute roller coaster. Let's break down the verdict, the appeal, and the reversal. So in 2014, the first verdict drops, and it's a surprise to many. Not guilty of murder, but guilty of culpable homicide. Now, what does that mean? Basically, the court said,
We don't think you meant to kill Reeva specifically, but your actions were so incredibly reckless that you're still to blame. I mean, firing 4 shots through a door, any reasonable person knows that could kill someone. The sentence for that? 5 years.
But wait, it's not over. The prosecution appealed. And they brought up this really important legal idea called dolus eventualis. It sounds complicated, but the concept is pretty simple. It basically says you don't have to want to kill a specific person for it to be murder. If you do something where you can clearly see that someone could die and you go ahead and do it anyway, that's murder. It doesn't even matter who the victim turns out to be.
And the Supreme Court of Appeal totally agreed with that argument. Their logic was, look, Oscar Pistorius knows guns. He had to have known that firing a high-caliber weapon into a tiny little room was almost certainly going to kill whoever was in there. And because he knew that and pulled the trigger anyway, that's dolus eventualis. So just like that, they threw out the old verdict and found him guilty of murder.
And man, this timeline just shows you what a legal seesaw this was. It starts in 2014 with that 5-year sentence for culpable homicide. Then boom, 2015, it's overturned and changed to murder. He gets resentenced to 6 years in 2016, but the state appeals again saying that's not enough. So in 2017, the sentence gets jacked up to 15 years. And this whole wild ride finally ends for now with his release on parole in 2024.
So, after all the drama, all the appeals, all the headlines, what's the final chapter? Let's talk about what happened after the gavel fell for the last time. When all was said and done, Oscar Pistorius serves 9 years behind bars for the murder of Reeva Steenkamp. On January 5th, 2024, he was released on parole, and he'll now serve the rest of his sentence under very strict conditions.
You know, I don't think anyone summed it up better than the judges at the Supreme Court of Appeal. They described the whole thing as a human tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. And that really hits it, doesn't it? The fallen hero, the brutal death, and the complete devastation left behind for 2 families.
And that brings us to the final lingering question that this whole case leaves us with. This trial pulled back the curtain on a global celebrity, and what we saw was messy, complex, and, in the end, maybe unknowable. It really makes you think, doesn't it? For any public figure we see, where does that polished image end and where does the real person actually begin?